My name is Hazel Monroe. I am 31 years old, a home care nurse, with red hair I stopped straightening years ago, and a body I stopped hiding under oversized scrubs. Once I realized nobody in that house was looking at me closely enough to notice anyway. For 6 years, the only life I really had was the small yellow house on Ferry Street, where I took care of my grandmother, Eleanor, until the day she died in my arms. That was not the hardest day, though I expected it to be for a long time. The hardest day came 3 days later, in a lawyer's conference room, when my Aunt Carol stood up, pointed her finger at me, and said the words that changed everything. She's been stealing from Grandma Eleanor for years. I want the police involved before this goes any further. I sat there in my black dress, my hands still raw from 6 years of lifting a woman twice my size out of bed, bathing her, feeding her, holding her through nights so bad I stopped counting them, and I listened to my own aunt accuse me of theft in front of a stranger with a briefcase. The lawyer looked at me, then at a folder in front of him. Then slowly, he slid a single page across the table. "Ms. Monroe," he said, "before anyone says another word, I think you need to see this bank statement." I picked it up with hands that would not stop shaking. It was not my name on the account. It never had been. To understand how I ended up in that room, I have to go back 6 years, to a Tuesday night when I was 25 and still working nights in the intensive care unit at St. Agnes Hospital, still telling myself I was building a real career. My mother, Diane, called at 11 at night, her voice tight in a way I recognized from childhood, the voice she used when something had already gone wrong and she was deciding how much of it to tell me. Grandma Eleanor fell again. 2nd time this month. The doctor says she can't live alone anymore. Eleanor was my father's mother, 78 at the time, sharp-tongued and stubborn, the kind of woman who raised 4 children and buried a husband without once asking anyone for help. She lived in the yellow house my grandfather had built with his own hands after the war, the only home she ever wanted. "What's the plan?" I asked. "Assisted living?" My mother hesitated too long. "Carol says she can't take her in. Her back can't handle lifting. Marjorie's in Arizona. She's not driving cross-country every week. Eleanor won't hear of a facility. You're a nurse, Hazel. You'd know how to do this properly. It would only be for a little while." I said yes. Not because I was naive, but because I loved her. Because she used to sneak me peppermint candy in church and tell me I was the only one in the family who really listened when she talked. I told myself 6 months sounded manageable. 6 months became a year became 3, then 5, then 6. I moved into the small bedroom at the back of the house, the one that used to be my father's when he was a boy. I gave up my apartment. I left my hospital position for slower home care work that paid less than half what I'd earned in the ICU. I told myself it was temporary, that I would go back to my real career once things stabilized. They never did. Eleanor's health declined the way it does for most elderly people, slowly, then all at once. Diabetes, a hip replacement that never fully healed, 2 small strokes that left her with a limp on her left side and a temper sharper than it had ever been. I learned things a nursing degree never prepared me for. How to bathe her without either of us feeling humiliated. How to sit with her at 3 in the morning when the pain in her hip wouldn't let her sleep. How to argue gently until she agreed to take medication she insisted she didn't need. Carol visited every few weeks at first, always with the same tight smile, always leaving within the hour with some excuse about traffic. My mother called more than she visited, 4 hours away in Ohio. My father had died when I was 19, a heart attack at 51, which I think is part of why I said yes in the first place. Taking care of his mother felt like the last thing I could still do for him. Around the second year, Carol began handling what she called the practical side of things. She had power of attorney over Eleanor's finances, a fact I only learned when I asked, innocently, how the pharmacy bills were being paid. "I've got it handled," Carol told me. "Eleanor set it up years ago. I manage her accounts, pay the bills, deal with Medicare and the supplemental insurance. You just focus on taking care of her day to day." I felt relieved at the time. Financial paperwork had never been something I wanted to manage on top of everything else, and Carol was, after all, Eleanor's own daughter. It made sense that she'd have legal authority over the money. What I didn't think to question, not for a long time, was where exactly that money was going. Eleanor received a modest pension from my grandfather's years at the steel plant, along with Social Security and a long-term care insurance policy she'd taken out decades earlier, back when she was healthy enough to think clearly about the future. That policy specifically covered in-home nursing care, and it was not small. Combined with her other income, her account should have supported a full-time paid caregiver comfortably. I was never paid for a single day of it. I told myself, for years, that this was simply what family did. Carol mentioned the house once, casually, in my third year there. "You know Mama wants you to have it eventually. It only makes sense, after everything you've given up." I held on to that sentence more tightly than I probably should have. It became the quiet justification for every missed birthday, every canceled friendship, every year that passed without a real income or a real life outside those four walls. The cracks started showing around year 5, though I didn't let myself see them clearly. Eleanor mentioned, during one of her clearer afternoons, that Carol had been borrowing from her account. "Borrowing for what, Grandma?" "Oh, you know Carol. Car trouble, house repairs. She always pays it back." Eleanor waved a hand, dismissive, the way she dismissed anything she didn't want to think too hard about. "It's family money, Hazel. It goes where it's needed." I let it go. I'd learned that questioning Carol's handling of things usually led to arguments I didn't have the energy for, arguments that always somehow ended with me feeling guilty for asking. By year 6, Eleanor's health collapsed faster than any of us expected. A silent heart attack in March left her permanently weaker. By May, she needed oxygen most hours of the day. By August, hospice began visiting twice a week. It was during those final months that a hospice nurse named Patricia, who had been doing this work for over 20 years, sat with me one evening after Eleanor had finally fallen asleep and asked a question that seemed simple at the time. "Who's handling Eleanor's long-term care insurance claims? A policy like hers at this stage should be covering nearly all of her in-home care costs. Are you being reimbursed for your hours?" "I'm not paid," I said. "I'm family." Patricia's expression shifted just slightly. "Hazel, that's typically several $1,000s a month. Where is that money going, if not to you?" I didn't have an answer. For the first time in 6 years, I realized I genuinely didn't know. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the small back bedroom, listening to Eleanor's oxygen machine hum down the hall, thinking about every vague explanation Carol had ever given me, every casual mention of borrowing, every time I'd swallowed my questions because family wasn't supposed to keep score. I decided that night to finally look. The next morning, while Eleanor slept later than usual, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and requested a full claims history from the insurance company's provider portal, listed as Eleanor's primary in-home caregiver on file. It took 2 days for full access to come through. When the records finally arrived, I printed every page. The policy had been paying out steadily for 5 years. ever since Eleanor's care level was reassessed following her first stroke, just over $6,000 a month. 5 years. $6,000 a month. $360,000, paid directly into an account linked to Eleanor's estate. I had never seen a cent of it. I called the insurance company that afternoon. A claims representative explained, carefully, that all reimbursements were paid to the designated financial power of attorney, distributed according to whatever caregiving arrangement was documented on file. "Whose name is listed as the caregiver of record?" I asked. A pause. "The file lists a licensed home health aid agency, Cedar Falls Family Care Services." I had never heard of that company in my life. I opened my laptop and searched the name. Cedar Falls Family Care Services was registered as an LLC, formed 6 years earlier, the same year I moved into the Yellow House. The listed registered agent was a name I recognized immediately. Marjorie Simmons, my aunt in Arizona. I stared at the screen for a long time, certain I'd misread it somehow. Marjorie, who visited twice a year at most, who called Eleanor on holidays and little else, whose entire involvement in her mother's care, as far as I'd ever witnessed, consisted of sending flowers and expressing sympathy over the phone. I called my mother that evening. "Did you know Marjorie has some kind of home care business registered? Cedar Falls Family Care Services?" The silence on the other end told me everything before she said a word. "Hazel, I think you should talk to Carol about this. I'm asking you. It's complicated. There were arrangements made for tax purposes so the insurance payments could be processed more smoothly. Marjorie's company handles the paperwork side. Mom, I am the one providing care every single day for 6 years. Why would an insurance company be paying a business in Arizona that has never once sent anyone to this house?" Her voice grew quieter, almost apologetic, though not quite apologetic enough. I didn't ask too many questions, honestly. I assumed you were being taken care of somehow, through a different arrangement. I was never paid a single dollar, Mom. Not once, in 6 years. Another long silence. I didn't know that. I swear to you, I didn't know that. I believed her mostly, though I noticed she still hadn't answered my original question. I hung up shortly after, feeling not anger exactly, but the slow, sick realization that people I trusted had been quietly building something around me for years, while I was too busy, too tired, too trusting to look up and notice. I didn't confront Carol immediately. I wanted more than a name on a business filing. I wanted to understand exactly how the money moved before I said a single word to anyone. Patricia helped me more than she probably should have, given it wasn't technically her job. She'd seen versions of this story before, she told me quietly one evening while checking Eleanor's oxygen levels. Families where one sibling does all the physical caregiving, while another manages the money. And somehow, over time, the money stops being about the person who needs care at all. "You should talk to an elder law attorney," she said, "not to cause trouble, to understand your legal position, before Eleanor passes and everyone starts fighting over what's left." I found an attorney 2 towns over, Denise Ferrara, who specialized in elder financial abuse cases, and brought her every document I had. She spent nearly 2 hours going through the claims history, the LLC registration, and the pattern of withdrawals from Eleanor's checking account I'd finally gained enough access to review. What she found made the $6,000 a month feel almost like the smaller part of the story. Over 6 years, in addition to the insurance reimbursements funneled through Marjorie's shell company, Carol had been withdrawing cash from Eleanor's checking account in amounts just under the threshold that would trigger automatic bank reporting, roughly $9,000, spread across dozens of withdrawals. Denise estimated the total, combined with the insurance diversions, at just over $500,000 across 6 years. $500,000, while I lived on savings I no longer had, while I ate the same groceries Eleanor ate because I couldn't afford much else, while I told myself the house would someday be mine, as though that promise had ever been anything more than a sentence Carol used to keep me quiet. "There's something else," Denise said, sliding a final document toward me. I pulled Eleanor's most recent will, filed 8 months ago. "I want you to read the distribution section carefully." I read it once, then again, certain I'd misunderstood. The will named Carol as executor. It divided the remaining estate, including the house on Ferry Street, equally between Carol and Marjorie. I wasn't mentioned at all, not the years, not the care, not even a token gesture toward the granddaughter who had given up her career, her apartment, her 20s, to keep an old woman alive in the home she loved. "When was this signed?" I asked, my voice barely holding steady. 8 months ago, at Carol's house, with Carol's attorney present as drafting counsel, and Marjorie as a witness by video call. 8 months earlier, Eleanor had suffered her second stroke only 3 months before, still recovering, still occasionally confused about the day of the week, still relying on me to remind her to take her afternoon medication. Was she competent to sign a new will at that point? I asked. Denise's expression told me she'd been waiting for exactly that question. "That," she said, "is precisely what we may need to find out." I left her office that afternoon with a folder heavier than the one I'd walked in with, and drove home in a kind of numb silence I still can't fully describe. Eleanor was awake when I arrived, sitting up against her pillows, thinner than even a month earlier, her eyes tired but still sharp. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Hazel," she said. I sat beside her bed and took her hand, the same hand I'd held through 6 years of nights that never seemed to end. "Grandma," I said carefully, "do you remember signing a new will about 8 months ago at Aunt Carol's house?" Eleanor's brow furrowed, the particular confusion that had become familiar over the last year. "A will," she repeated slowly. "Carol mentioned updating paperwork. I don't recall reading it. She said it was just formalities." Something settled heavily in my chest. "Grandma, do you know how much money has come out of your accounts over the last 6 years? For your care?" She looked at me for a long moment, and for just a second, some flicker of her old sharpness returned. The woman who had run a household of 4 children on a steel worker's salary and never once let anyone shortchange her. "Hazel," she said quietly, "what did you find?" I told her everything. I still don't know if it was the right decision, telling a dying woman that her own children had been stealing from her for years, while her granddaughter went unpaid and unrecognized. But I couldn't sit there and let her die believing a version of her family that wasn't true. Eleanor was quiet a long time. Then she asked me to bring her the phone and her old address book, the worn leather one she still kept in her nightstand drawer. "There's a number in there, under W. Whitfield, my old attorney before Carol started insisting I use hers instead. Call him. Tell him Eleanor Monroe needs to see him, tonight, if he can manage it." I dialed with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since I'd left Denise's office. The old attorney answered on the second ring, and when I explained who was calling and why, there was a pause, followed by words that told me this story went back further than even I'd understood. "Eleanor Monroe," he said slowly. "I wondered when someone would finally call me again. I have a file for her I was told to hold on to until she asked for it herself, or until it became clear certain people were no longer acting in her interest. Mr. Whitfield arrived just after 8 that evening, an older man with a slight stoop and a briefcase as worn as Eleanor's address book. He had been her attorney for nearly 30 years, he told me quietly in the hallway, until Carol gradually eased him out 4 years earlier, insisting Eleanor needed someone more current. I always found that reasoning strange, he admitted. Eleanor Monroe never once complained about my work in 26 years. But your grandmother has always been a woman who avoids conflict with her own children, even when she probably shouldn't. I understood that better than he could have known. We sat with Eleanor together, propped up against her pillows, oxygen tube resting beneath her nose, and Mr. Whitfield opened his briefcase to reveal a file considerably thicker than I expected. "Eleanor," he said gently, 4 years ago, before Carol asked me to step back from your affairs, you came to my office and asked me to draft something. Do you remember?" "The letter," Eleanor said quietly. "I remember the letter." He pulled out a sealed envelope and a formal document, both dated 4 years earlier, well before the will that erased my 6 years of care. "This is your actual most recent valid will," he said, "executed while you were of sound mind, independently witnessed, with a full competency evaluation on file, specifically because you told me someday someone might challenge it. It's never been revoked. The document Carol had you sign 8 months ago, using her own attorney rather than independent counsel, may not hold up in probate court at all, given your medical records from that period. Read it to her," Eleanor said. "All of it. Hazel should hear it too." The will, 4 years old, divided her estate differently than the one Carol had produced. It named me as executor. It left the house on Ferry Street directly to me, along with 40% of her remaining assets. The rest split between Carol and Marjorie. Attached was a letter, handwritten in Eleanor's careful script. Mr. Whitfield read it aloud, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Dear Hazel, if you are ever reading this, it likely means something has gone wrong between us as a family, something I could see coming even 4 years ago, though I hoped I was simply an old woman with too much time to worry. I have watched Carol manage my finances for years and noticed things I chose, foolishly, not to question closely enough. I am writing this because I want you to know, clearly, and in my own words, exactly what I intended, in case anyone ever tries to convince you otherwise. You gave up more for me than any of my own children ever have. I watched you sacrifice your career, your independence, your 20s, sitting beside me through nights I know were harder on you than you ever let me see. I do not believe love should require that kind of sacrifice from anyone, and I am ashamed I allowed it to continue as long as it has, telling myself each year we would figure something out eventually. This house was built by your grandfather's hands. I want it to belong to someone who understands what it means to build something through daily devotion, rather than convenience. That has always been you, Hazel, not because you are owed it, but because you have already shown every single day for years exactly the kind of person you are. If Carol or Marjorie ever try to tell you I forgot you, or that I chose differently in the end, do not believe them. I have not forgotten a single year you gave me. I only wish I had said thank you more often, out loud, while I still had the strength to say it properly. I love you more than any of them ever understood. Grandma Eleanor. I couldn't speak for several minutes. Eleanor reached for my hand, her grip weaker than even a month earlier, and simply held it, the two of us sitting in silence while the oxygen machine hummed steadily beside her bed. I should have said it myself, she whispered eventually. Years ago, I let Carol convince me that discussing money with you would seem transactional, as though loving you and being honest about what I owed you were somehow different things. You're saying it now, I said quietly. Now is very late, Hazel. It's not too late, I said, though I'm not certain either of us fully believed it. Eleanor passed away 11 days later, in the early morning hours, with me holding her hand exactly as I had through 6 years of harder nights. The funeral itself was quiet, small, exactly the kind Eleanor had always said she wanted. Carol and Marjorie both attended, along with my mother, a scattering of old neighbors, and a handful of Eleanor's remaining friends from church. I stood through the service in a kind of numb exhaustion, not yet knowing that the hardest conversation of my life was waiting only 3 days away, in a lawyer's conference room, where Carol would stand and accuse me of theft, apparently confident that the will she'd orchestrated 8 months earlier was the only version of Eleanor's wishes anyone in that room would ever see. She did not yet know about Mr. Whitfield. I looked up from the bank statement, my hands finally steady enough to hold the page without shaking, and understood exactly what I was looking at. The account was titled Cedar Falls Family Care Services. 6 years of deposits from the insurance policy, $6,000 a month, nearly every payment withdrawn in cash within days of arriving, split between Carol and Marjorie's individual accounts. This isn't my account, I said quietly. I've never seen this statement in my life. Carol's face had gone rigid. That account paid for professional caregiving services that supplemented whatever you were doing. There was no professional service, I said. I was the only person in that house for 6 years. I bathed her. I fed her. I sat with her every single night. There was no agency. There were no aides. I looked. You had no right to go digging through Mama's private financial records. The lawyer, Mr. Talbot, cleared his throat. Actually, given that Ms. Monroe is listed as the primary in-home caregiver on Eleanor's medical and insurance records, she had every legal right to request her own claims documentation, which is precisely how this came into her possession, through a formal records request, not digging. Carol's mouth opened and closed. Regardless, Mama's will names me executor and divides the estate between myself and Marjorie. Hazel isn't mentioned at all, which reflects Mama's own wishes. About that, I said, and placed Mr. Whitfield's file on the table. Carol's expression shifted the moment she saw the name on the tab. That's not possible. Whitfield hasn't handled Mama's affairs in years. Because you eased him out 4 years ago, around the same time you set up Marjorie's shell company and started diverting insurance payments that should have gone toward my actual care of your mother. Mr. Talbot read through the older will slowly, the competency evaluation, the independent witnesses, the letter. When he finished, he set the file down and looked directly at Carol. This will predates the one you submitted by 4 years, he said. It appears to have been properly executed, independently witnessed, and supported by a documented competency evaluation. The will you submitted 8 months ago was drafted by your own attorney, with your sister as the sole outside witness, during a period when Eleanor's medical records show she had recently suffered a second stroke with documented intermittent confusion. That's irrelevant, Carol said, though her voice had lost its certainty. She was still competent enough to sign her own name. Perhaps, Mr. Talbot said carefully. That will likely need to be determined by the probate court, but regardless of which will controls the estate, I have a separate and more immediate concern. He tapped the bank statement. This documents a sustained pattern of diverting insurance reimbursements intended for Eleanor's care, along with cash withdrawals structured specifically to avoid bank reporting thresholds. That is potential elder financial abuse and fraud, and given that Eleanor is now deceased, it will likely draw the attention of the state's Adult Protective Services Division, regardless of what any of us decide next. The room went very quiet. Marjorie, who had said almost nothing, had gone pale, staring at the bank statement as though she could make it disappear by looking hard enough. "I want to be clear about something," I said, my voice steadier than it had been since I walked into that office. "I am not here for revenge. I did not spend 6 years taking care of my grandmother hoping it would end in a courtroom. I did it because I loved her, and because somebody needed to, and none of the rest of you were willing." "You did it because you wanted the house," Carol said. "Don't pretend otherwise." "I did it because she was dying alone otherwise," I said. "The house was never why I stayed, but I'm not going to pretend I don't deserve what she actually wanted me to have, especially not after learning that while I gave up my career and my savings taking care of her, the two of you were quietly taking $500,000 out of her accounts and calling it administrative arrangements." "500,000, Marjorie repeated quietly, as though hearing the number spoken aloud made it real in a way the individual withdrawals never had. "That's the accountant's estimate, combined, over 6 years. I have the documentation. So does Mr. Talbot now, and so will Adult Protective Services, once this meeting concludes." Carol had no answer. Neither did Marjorie. Mr. Talbot spoke again, his tone carefully neutral. "I'd strongly recommend both of you retain independent legal counsel immediately. I intend to file notice with the probate court regarding the competing wills, and separately, given the scale of the discrepancies documented here, I have an obligation to report this to the appropriate authorities." Carol looked at me one last time before she left, her expression somewhere between fury and the beginning of fear. "You've ruined this family, Hazel." I thought of Eleanor's letter, of 6 years spent believing that love and sacrifice were supposed to look like silence, like never asking questions. "No," I said quietly. "I think you did that yourselves. I just finally looked closely enough to see it." The months that followed unfolded slowly, nothing like the swift resolution television makes it look like. Adult Protective Services opened a formal inquiry within 2 weeks, working alongside a forensic accountant named Susan Cho, who spent nearly 4 months tracing every dollar that had moved through Marjorie's shell company and Carol's personal accounts. The final report confirmed almost exactly what the initial documents suggested. $512,000 diverted from Eleanor's long-term care insurance and personal accounts over 6 years, structured carefully enough to avoid automatic reporting, but not carefully enough to survive an actual audit when someone finally asked the right questions. The probate court sided with Mr. Whitfield's older will, ruling that the more recent document, signed 8 months before Eleanor's death, without independent counsel, during a documented period of post-stroke confusion, didn't meet the legal standard for testamentary capacity. I became executor of my grandmother's estate. The house on Ferry Street, the one my grandfather built with his own hands, came to me exactly as Eleanor had intended. Carol and Marjorie were not charged criminally, in the end, though it was close. The district attorney's office reviewed the case for several weeks before deciding a civil restitution settlement served everyone's interests better than a lengthy criminal trial, particularly given that Eleanor's death removed the most direct victim testimony from the equation. Carol and Marjorie were ordered to repay the diverted funds in full, secured against both their properties, a debt that will likely take years to satisfy. I didn't celebrate the way I might have expected to 6 years earlier if someone had told me how this would end. There was no triumph in watching my aunt sign settlement paperwork, no satisfaction in numbers finally balancing on some ledger. Mostly I felt tired, the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 6 years being quietly underestimated by the very people who should have protected her most. My mother and I talked more honestly in the months after the settlement. She admitted she'd suspected something was wrong for years, that Carol's vague explanations about the finances had never quite sat right, and that she'd chosen not to look closely because looking would have meant confronting her own sister and possibly her own guilt over never once offering to take a turn caring for Eleanor herself. I should have asked more questions, she told me, sitting at the same kitchen table where I first discovered the claims history. I should have made sure you weren't giving up everything while the rest of us gave up nothing. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't. Not entirely. Not yet. But I told her I appreciated her saying it, which was true, and which felt like enough of a beginning for both of us. Carol has not spoken to me since the settlement was finalized. I understand that in a way I didn't expect to. It's difficult, I imagine, to face someone you tried to publicly accuse of theft, only to have the actual evidence reveal exactly the opposite. Marjorie called once, several months later, her voice thin and uncertain over the phone. I told myself it wasn't really stealing, she said. I told myself Mama would have wanted us to have it eventually anyway. So what did the timing really matter? I didn't have a gracious response for that, and I didn't pretend to. Some sentences simply sit there, unanswered, because there's nothing left to say that would make either person feel better about what happened. I still work as a home care nurse, though differently now. I took the licensing exam for a formal caregiving credential I'd never bothered pursuing during my years with Eleanor, since at the time it hadn't seemed to matter to anyone whether my work was recognized or paid. I opened a small home care consulting practice out of the Yellow House, helping other families navigate exactly the kind of insurance and legal questions that took me 6 years and a dying woman's letter to finally understand for myself. I kept my grandfather's woodworking tools in the garage and Eleanor's letter framed on the wall of what used to be her bedroom, now converted into my office. I read it, sometimes, on the harder days, the ones where a new client's family reminds me of my own. One sibling quietly disappearing while another quietly gives up everything and calls it love. I think most days about the particular kind of theft nobody talks about in courtrooms. Not just the money, though the money mattered, and I don't pretend otherwise. The years mattered more. 6 years I will never get back, spent believing that silence and sacrifice were the price of being loved, that eventually someone would notice what I'd given up and say thank you before it was too late. Eleanor said it, in the end, though later than either of us would have wanted. I choose to believe that counts for something, even now. The house on Ferry Street is quiet these days, in a different way than it used to be. Not the heavy, waiting quiet of illness and long nights, but something closer to peace, the kind that comes from finally living somewhere because you chose to, rather than because nobody else would. I did not get 6 years of my life back. I did not get an apology that felt like enough. Not really. Not from Carol, and only partly from Marjorie. What I got, in the end, was something I had stopped believing I deserved somewhere around the 3rd year of nights that blurred into each other without anyone asking how I was holding up. I got the truth, finally spoken out loud, in my grandmother's own handwriting, telling me that all of it, every sacrifice, every missed year, every silent night, had been seen. It had simply taken far too long for anyone to say so. Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.